Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Ishani Mukherjee. I am Faculty of Public Policy here at SMU in Singapore. I am joined today by Dr. Sarah Geest of Leiden University to briefly talk about our paper with Professor Michael Howlett of SFU. This paper is entitled The Future of Policy Tools, Promises and Pitfalls, and we are delighted to have written this for the inaugural issue of the Korea Institute of Public Administration Public Policy Review. We are going to highlight two examples of future policy tools that we have broadly covered in our paper. I will present a brief introduction on what is understood as traditional policy tools, and I will move on to speak briefly about behavioral insights and nudges as our first example of future tools. Dr. Geest will then follow with the second example of such tools and speak briefly about digital policy instruments and those governing big data. And then we shall conclude this presentation by outlining several future considerations for research. Now, to speak briefly of the traditional tools of government and in the way that we have presented this discussion in the paper, there are several ways of organizing policy tools, several ways of organizing public policy tools. One way of doing this is by looking at the effect that the tool is having. And the first distinction that we make in the paper is that of between substantive tools versus procedural tools. Now, in substantive tools, usually look at the effect that the tool has on the society outside of the government and as a tool of governing the public. And these tools are formulated in order to govern the production, the consumption, and the distribution of public and private goods and services. These tools are more outward facing, and these are what we generally understand when we talk about public policy tools. The second distinction that we have made in the paper is of a lesser studied but equally important category of tools known as procedural tools. And these tools are more inward facing to the government. And these are the tools that government designs in order to govern its own inner workings. So some example of procedural tools has been very prominent now in the era of COVID-19, where we find governments of various governments in various jurisdictions employ procedural tools to organize themselves into task forces or advisory committees that are dedicated towards the management of the pandemic within their boundaries. So this first distinction has been made in the literature in order to have this external versus internal focus on when we discuss public policy tools. Another way of discussing public policy tools is to look at the type of government's resources that are allocated to its design to formulate these tools. In the general understanding of the literature, we identify four main types of resources that the government is able to employ when they are devising public policy tools. And these four types of government resources are namely those of nodality or information sharing that the government is able to do by being a part of, the main kind of policy networks in every jurisdiction. Secondly, we've got authority-based tools, or these are the tools that rely on the legal power of the government. Thirdly, we've got treasure-based tools, which rely on the money assets of the government. And these are the tools that are formulated in order to govern public spending, public finances, taxes, subsidies, grants, loans, all kinds of financing that falls under the public realm. Lastly, we've got organization-based tools or the government's capacity and capability to structure its actions and also to partner with other organizations in order to carry out a public task. Some examples of tools that are dominated by certain classes of resources are given here below, and we also mentioned these in our paper. Now, while we have this very distinct discussion about traditional policy tools, what is new about future tools is how they're getting difficult to classify or categorize using existing rubrics. One such tool are behavioral insights or nudges. What is a nudge? This is a question that many of us have been studying for the past several years. A nudge is basically any aspect of the design of a choice that an individual makes as a member of the public that changes their behavior in a predictable way, without forbidding anything, without costing anything, and without actually changing the choice itself. Now, the assumption of any such mechanism that does this is that there is always something beyond that goes beyond formal incentives or sanctions or punishments or carrots or sticks that can impact the choice architecture or the environment within which we make choices as members of the public, right? And that environment makes it likely for us to make one particular choice over the other, right? So that something is what is meant by behavioral insights. And what this has done with it is that these tools have brought with them a heightened understanding of what the behavior of policy targets, and that these behaviors are not the same. They're not very predictable. They tend to be heterogeneous, and they're not always predictable or constant. And this is often in direct contrast with what is, with mainstream policymaking that has traditionally been informed by standard theories about people's reactions to policy and people's and then the way people behave when a policy is designed and deployed. And what we have discovered is over time is that for members of the public, these behaviors are not always rational, and the preferences that they make our preferences over time as members of the public are not always stable. Some examples of behavioral tools and nudges, you'll be surprised at how many there are surrounding you. There's been a surge in an application of nudges, especially in policymaking in the energy domain, which is what Dr. Geist and I specialize in. And it is often presented as an easy and low cost intervention to alter individual behaviors. Here you see examples of energy ratings that are mandated in governments of Australia, in the EU, as well as here in Singapore. And these are energy labels that are applied to household appliances. These give you a variety of information in a certain way, which tends to encourage the purchase of certain goods versus the others. So the behaviors can be related, that are related to consumption can actually be can address a variety of interests than just a plain simple piece of paper giving all the information. So those who are in the business of designing behavioral tools and nudges understand that these tools can actually trigger various rationalities or various thinking processes in members of the public. And what these variations are, at first glance, they can look at variations of previous efforts that the government has made on nodality tools, what we saw in the previous slide, or changing the public's behavior through information. But while these tools look like they're information-based tools and are only giving you certain information, there is a very nuanced understanding of rationality that underlies their design. And this is because the two kinds of thinking that those studying policy tools tend to look into uh, make us understand that as members of the public, we tend to behave in a variety of ways given different situations. An example of a nudge here is what can be found in public transport here in Singapore, which instead of just giving you a sign saying that this is reserved for people who the seat is reserved for people who need it, actually flavors this with a social norm of being nice when or making it a peaceful ride, or making it a harmonious ride while you are in a public transport or public train in Singapore. And these nudges are devised with understanding that people behave in different ways because they're always using, or they're using two types of thinking to do different activities. The first kind of thinking is system one thinking, and we get into this in a little bit of detail in the paper. But system one thinking are things that we do on autopilot in our day-to-day lives, something like taking your daily commute, taking your daily bus to work. And these are things we don't often think so much about because they're autopilot. These are distinct from the system two type of thinking, which requires a lot of cognitive and in cognitive kind of investment on your part to do a lot of planning, to do a lot of information processing. And an example of this is planning a trip overseas. So those who are designing behavioral tools are coming up with this distinction, saying that some tools can be effective because they appeal to system one thinking of people, things that you would do even without thinking, it'll just nudge you in that direction. And system two thinking is harder to nudge because that type of thinking generally requires you to do a lot more in terms of information processing, right? So having bifurcated rationality into these two systems, um, the tools that link the policy tools that are coming out in our times using behavioral insights and nudges have actually been, a very interesting area to study. There's been a massive rise in studies coming out of policy labs and behavioral labs in the last decade as to how to design and deploy these tools. Um, but then again, there's a question about whether they are tools by themselves or they are something that embellishes existing tools, right? And this is because the impact on public behavior has been mixed and very specific. And so gaps remain in the theorization of what do we do with behavioral tools? Are they standalone instruments or are they enhancing existing instruments? How do they interact with existing regulations and instruments on the ground, as well as counter nudges? Do we need supporting tool for these nudges? All of these signify the kinds of questions that we are now dealing with or trying to answer in policy instrument studies when we look at behavioral insights and nudges. Um, I will now pass the mic over to Dr. Geest, who will be talking about digital tools and big data.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I'd like to take the next couple of minutes to talk about digital tools and big data. And in the paper, we distinguish between tools of digital nature and tools that enable or prohibit technology use and data collection. And we make this distinction to highlight that there's tools that use or utilize technologies and new volumes or types of data to obtain certain policy goals. And there's also tools that look at the regulation of that data or those technologies and thereby affect R&D activities, for example. So when we look at the tools of digital nature, what we can think about as an example is fraud detection through machine learning techniques and data linking. So there's quite a few agencies all around the world that now use machine learning to look at data sets that they've newly linked or additional data to figure out patterns among the data and figure out who's most likely to defraud the system. And then for tools enabling or prohibiting technology use and data collection, we can think about examples where government thinks about how to protect the privacy of the data while also making it available to private companies, for example. So when we think of smart meters or in-home displays in houses, they're usually installed to limit energy consumption and to reduce energy consumption as a whole. But there is this conflict in the sense that it's usually private companies developing these technologies to further that goal of a reduction in energy consumption. But then you have a public infrastructure and public data that the companies need to tap into. So then the question is, has government caught up with regulating the public data in a way that it would be accessible in a safe way to private companies? And as you've already seen with that example, these two ideas are linked in a sense that government utilizes data to sharpen existing instruments, as we've seen with the fraud detection. But they also, in doing that, they have to think about how to safely share data and how to regulate the data sharing practices with private companies. In the paper, we also address digital tools and public engagement. So these are tools when we think about public engagement in terms of platforms or forums or voting. These are new ways to engage citizens in decision-making processes. So when you think about neighborhoods, for example, there's ways to engage citizens on voting on certain projects, for example, another playground, more park benches, more parking spots, these kinds of things. And then the question becomes, is that a good tool with the goal of actually engaging more people and potentially being more inclusive? And there's current research and discussion around whether these online platforms actually will be more inclusive or whether it will only select these people who are already motivated to participate, and you will have so-called sort of the usual suspects involved in the process. So this is a discussion we touch upon for the paper. And to look back a little bit, including the section on behavioral instruments and then also digital tools, what we see is that there's varied patterns of tool use in government. And we also see several shifts that are happening. But actually, when we look more closely, they're actually less dramatic than we often assume. So when we think of these grand ideas of machine learning, what we actually see is that these new policy tools have to be compatible with previously existing governance modes. And also they rely significantly on current regulatory practices within certain countries or within a subset of countries. So what we see is not this big transformation of tools, but actually what we see is maybe more of a layering or incremental calibration of tools, and then also incremental policy learning and feedback mechanisms around these tools. Thank you very much for listening.